have used so far. There's also a chat box. Both should be the same thing if you've got both. I've heard sometimes that people have both. Sometimes you've got one. So if you type anything into the question box or the chat box, we will be monitoring that throughout the webinar. I'll do the best that I can to stay on top of questions as they come in. And at times during the webinar, you may be invited to share something verbally. If you want to, there's a little hand icon on your screen. If you click on that, that's the equivalent of raising your hand, and we can call on you and unmute any of the folks that are interested in speaking. I will save some time at the end of the webinar for questions that I can't get to during the course of the webinar. And a copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar will be posted on the OSSE website within the next week. After we complete the webinar, you will receive a survey via email tomorrow that asks you to fill it out, and at the bottom of the survey there will be an option to enter your email and name for professional learning units, or PLUs, if you are interested in that. So you have to attend the full webinar and take the survey to receive the professional learning unit for this session. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And before we get started, I'd like to do a quick poll and ask you all, why are you here? So if you could, I'm going to launch a poll. If you could respond to the question on your screen, why did you choose to attend this webinar today? Is it because you feel that you are math anxious? Do you have math anxious students, colleagues who are math anxious, or are you just curious and want to learn more about math anxiety? You can check more than one response if multiple responses apply to you. Okay. All right, I'm going to close that. Let's see if I can. So as you can see on the screen here, the poll results, we've got a few math anxious folks in the room, or in our session today, but we see a lot of math anxious students and a lot of math anxiety curiosity. So we'll try to address both of those as we go, or all of those as we go through the session today. So getting started, we're going to look at a little self-reflection on math anxiety. The goal for this is really to be honest with yourself. So awareness in math anxiety is really key. Teachers who are aware of their own personal feelings toward math really can support students that are experiencing math anxiety, whereas unaware teachers just tend to perpetuate the cycle. So we're going to spend some time at the beginning of this webinar really self-reflecting. So thinking of yourself as a learner, if you have a piece of scrap paper around you, I'd encourage you to take that out and draw just the long line with the continuum from disagree to agree. And I'm going to read a series of prompts and ask you to mark an X or a check mark or some sort of indicator of where you fall on this continuum when I read the following statements. One challenge I am going to give you is that little line in the middle. If you can imagine that as an X. You may not be neutral on any of these statements. So really challenge yourself to figure out if you fall to the right or to the left of the center, and how far to the right or to the left. I have been told I'm not good at math. So thinking of yourself as a learner, indicate to yourself whether you'd be more on the agree side or the disagree side, and how far. One or both of my parents is not a math person. When it's time for a math test, I feel overcome with panic. Just a reminder to be honest with yourself. Nobody's seeing your responses but you. I prefer to work on math alone rather than in groups of my peers. I tend to zone out when the topic of discussion is math. Math problems that don't have one right answer are stressful. I feel uneasy when asked to explain my solution to a math problem. When asked to do a math problem, I sometimes draw a blank. It stresses me out not to know the answer to a math problem. I am uncomfortable asking for help on math problems. I regularly avoid situations in which I have to use math. Boys are wired to be better at math than girls. Some people are innately better at math than others. I contribute less in groups when the topic is math. Math is stressful. I have experienced math anxiety as a student. I have experienced math anxiety in my professional life. I am not a math person. As you look at your continuum, one that's in front of you, what do you notice about where your X's fell? What insights can you gain from where you placed your X's on that continuum? The more X's to the right and the further to the right might indicate math anxiety. So our challenge today is to think for ourselves and for our students, how can we really move any marks on the right of the continuum over to the left? Math anxiety does not equal math ability. We have to unlearn that anxiety or learn to succeed in math despite that anxiety. If you have math anxiety, it's okay. Some of our most accomplished mathematicians and college-level professors experience symptoms related with math anxiety. The same is true for stage fright or the fear of public speaking. Many actors and performers have stage fright, and they keep that stage fright long into their careers. So the goal here is really not to eliminate the fear necessarily, but to learn how to be successful in spite of that fear and how to overcome it every time you step onto stage. Performers like Brandy, Barbara Streisand, Rihanna, and Katy Perry all have extreme stage fright and a fear of public speaking. Adele actually announced yesterday that she may never tour again because her stage fright is so intense. That does not mean that she's not a phenomenal performer. So the same is true of math anxiety. Just because folks have math anxiety does not mean that they don't have math ability or that they can't figure out how to solve the math problems. In our society, math anxiety has really become a dinner table convo. It's very normal to hear people say, oh, I'm not a math person, I'm not a numbers person. You very rarely will hear somebody say at a dinner table, yeah, I'm not really good at reading. I'm an illiterate person. That's not socially acceptable. Mathematics has a very tarnished reputation in our society, and it's commonly accepted that math is difficult, obscure, and of interest to only certain people, and those certain people tend to be the nerds and the geek of our society. There's this very unflattering characterization of math folks. We really need to eliminate that stigma associated with being good at math or being able to do math, and eliminating this idea that it is okay to be anxious about mathematics. So I'm going to issue a challenge to you all. If you have ever said this before, I'm going to challenge you never to say this again. And if you're not one that says this often, my challenge to you is to never let another person say this again. So what might we replace it with? How about math curiosity? Or even just saying math is challenging for me. Just like an actor with stage fright, it is something you can do. You can say, I have stage fright, but you can still be really good at getting on stage. Saying, I'm not a math person, I'm math curious instead. I'm curious about mathematics. It's okay to say math is challenging for me. That's okay. Saying I'm not a math person is not okay because it's wrong. You are a math person because you're a human. All humans do math. Humans do art, humans do music, humans build things, humans cry, humans laugh. It's what makes us human. So my challenge to you as we go through this webinar is to make sure that this is something that we take out of the air, whether it's something that you say or something that you hear people saying. I challenge you to eliminate that phrase. If you are somebody that experiences math anxiety, really work to get over that. Some strategies that you might try are doing math every day. Being very intentional about spending 30 minutes a day doing math. Finding excuses to calculate. And you can do this on your own, whether it's driving. Think about how many miles am I going to travel in this hour? How much gas am I getting per gallon? Whether it's at the grocery store paying attention to prices or how many things you need to make recipes. Cooking is a great way to play with fractions, but practicing math every day will increase your fluency and make it easier and not as overwhelming. When you're completing or when you're engaging in these math problems and you come upon something that's challenging, ask questions. And don't just ask questions for the sake of asking. Insist on understanding. So if something is complicated for you, it's your responsibility to really ask the tough questions and keep asking those questions until you understand the topic. Embrace your mistakes. And most importantly, practice some positive self-talk. And if you don't kick the phrase, I'm not a math person, for any other reason, consider this. Math anxiety can become a generational problem, especially those of us in the education world. We can't afford to pass on negative feelings toward math to our children and our students. So what is math anxiety? It's this feeling of intense frustration or helplessness about one's ability to do math, which can subsequently interfere with performance. And the key word in that first part of this definition is the word subsequent. Being good at math being not good at math, not being good at math does not cause anxiety. It's actually the other way around. The anxiety can really interfere with your performance in math. And then part two, it's an extreme emotional and or physical reaction to a very negative attitude toward math. I think often we forget that there is this physical aspect to that anxiety. It's not all in one's head, but there are actual physical and physiological reactions to this anxiety. So what causes it? Where does it come from? Generally speaking, math anxiety comes from bad math experiences. These can manifest in lots of different ways. Many of them are listed here. They're usually associated with punishment, failure, or embarrassment. Excuse me. If you've had math-phobic parents or teachers, it almost gives you permission as a learner to be okay with being math-phobic. High expectations of self is very common as well. There's this discomfort of making mistakes. And in math, there's this idea that there is one right answer, and if I don't get it, I must be bad at math. And that high expectation of self can often lead to some anxiety. And that often will also lead to these underdeveloped math skills. Time test is another one that is often cited as a cause of anxiety, where the focus is really on speed and not necessarily the student's skill or ability to do math. If we think of swimming, for instance, if the goal of a swimming class is to learn how to swim, How fast you swim is not necessarily relevant. If the goal is swimming, not necessarily competing in the Olympics, let's focus on that first. We often put in this pressure of time that makes the task even much harder and much more anxiety-inducing. Doesn't matter if you're not the fastest. What matters, especially in the early grades when we tend to use the most of the time tests, is can they do the math and can they be fluent in it? So eliminating time tests can often reduce anxiety as well. Three practices that are a regular part of the traditional math classroom and cause great anxiety are imposed authority, public exposure, and time deadlines. So what are the symptoms? There's panic. It's that feeling of helplessness that doesn't go away. It almost feels like a wave of terror is washed over your body when you're feeling that panic. There's also paranoia. When the student thinks that they're the only person in the entire world that's not capable of completing this math problem, regardless of how complicated it is or how true or false that might be. There's passive behavior, where the student decides, I'm never going to get this, there's no chance, so I'm just not going to do anything about it. It's this idea of really ignoring the problem or actively avoiding the problem. A lack of confidence, where there's an anticipation that I will not be good at this. I'm going to second guess my math work. We see this a lot in even adult learners, relying on other people around them or other people in their life to help them complete math functions such as balancing their checkbook. And another very common symptom of math anxiety is during testing or when asked a difficult question, students often find that their mind just went blank. They couldn't come up with anything. Through recent studies out of the University of Chicago and even Stanford University School of Medicine, researchers have determined that that the anxiety that math anxious folks feel when they're looking at a math problem is actually very similar neurologically to when a person experiences physical pain. So using brain scans, they were able to look at second and third grade students who were doing addition and subtraction. Students that reported feeling panicky had increased activity in their brain, in the parts of the brain that are associated with fear, and decreased activity in the parts of the brain that involve problem solving. So the same part of our brains that panics when we see a spider or a snake or whatever it may be that we're afraid of is also the same part of the brain that shows a heightened response when we're looking at math problems. So people that have math anxiety, it's very similar to having a fear of anything else. So what? We get into this cycle of math anxiety. We have a negative math experience, and because we've had this negative math experience, we then move on to avoiding math. Because we're avoiding math, we are therefore poorly prepared to be successful in math. Because we're not prepared, we then perform poorly. That poor performance leads us to a negative math experience. And this cycle continues and keeps repeating until it's almost impossible to break it, or can feel impossible to break it. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy where just because I say I'm not going to like math, it indirectly causes itself to become true, right? That belief between, that relationship between belief and behavior. So this never-ending cycle needs to be broken. And oftentimes for adults with math anxiety, the place to break it is really in that math avoidance. Forcing yourself to do more math, to find opportunities and entry points into math is often where adults are able to break the cycle. But for students or for teachers, as we think of ourselves as teachers and wanting to ensure that we break the cycle in our young learners, our role is really at the top of that circle and making sure that we are figuring out how can we create more and more positive math experiences to outweigh the number of negative math experiences our students have experienced or have had, so that they don't find themselves sitting in this cycle of never-ending bad math experience, avoidance, poor preparation, and poor math performance. But what if our students don't get out of this cycle? So what? Let's look at a few of the consequences of math anxiety. I'm sure you can all think of many times in your adult life where you've had to use math, but students with high math anxiety have limited career options, right? Especially STEM jobs at this point are expected to grow 70% faster than overall employment opportunities in our country, but we don't have students that are pursuing STEM degrees or STEM careers. With technology advancing at the rate it is, math is needed for most jobs that yield livable wages. Not having a workforce that is prepared to take this on is causing the United States to really rely on scientists and engineers from abroad and not being able to fulfill the needs here with our own students. There's also some very obvious financial implications of math anxiety. People's choices and investment options, retirement plans, whether it's some of the day-to-day stuff like how do you calculate a tip when you go out to dinner, or how much gas do I need to buy in order to get to where I'm going. Thinking about student loans, thinking about car loans, house loans, mortgage payments. There is a lot of financial implications that people who are math anxious tend to avoid, and it costs them a lot of money. Then they start paying other people to do their math for them, and in the end, they're actually losing in that scenario. Math anxious people also have an inability to accurately decipher statistics. This can be stuff as easy as, stuff as common as reading comprehension in newspapers, whether that's looking at a poll or a graph, other statistics around food, even thinking about nutrition labels or medical studies. Things of this, if you are not able to decipher the statistics, it could have real implications for your quality of life. Most interestingly, though, to me, is this idea that folks with math anxiety, it's been found to be linked to suboptimal everyday decisions. And so studies have been done that show that quick decisions, low confidence, and a tendency to rely on gut feelings over careful consideration is associated with this math anxiety. It's really that part of the brain that can problem solve and make smart decisions around advantageous choices or better decisions. For instance, there's been studies done of, do you prefer a large reward quickly? Sorry, I got that wrong. Do you prefer a larger reward available after a delay or a small, immediately available reward? So questions like this are questions that involve gambling. People with math anxiety don't really take the time to think through them and to really think about what's going to be in their better interest. So there is definitely some problem-solving ability that is lost with math anxiety, even when it doesn't necessarily come to numbers per se, or math as we traditionally think about it. So now that we know what math is, let's think a little bit about what that means for the math classroom. How does our math anxiety as adults impact the students in our classrooms? Studies show consistently that our elementary education majors have one of the highest levels of math anxiety in college campuses, and the same tends to be true for alternative certification programs that place teachers in elementary classrooms, which makes sense if we think about it. College seniors that are graduating and thinking about careers in teaching, when they're thinking about would I rather work with older kids or younger kids, many of our most math anxious applicants are saying, I want to work with the little ones because I don't need to know as much math, or because the math in elementary school is easier and I can handle that, which on the surface seems to make sense, but really that's where our youngest learners are getting the basis or the foundation of their ability to do math later in their education and in their careers. So this is a very dangerous statistic, because it's this helplessness and insecurity and inferiority that are common manifestations of math anxiety, and that's very common in elementary teachers. But when we have an elementary teacher or a middle school teacher, really any math teacher that is math anxious, We see it in the classroom. These teachers tend to spend more class time on whole class instruction. If you avoid small groups, you don't have to answer as many questions, and you don't have to be put on the spot. Oftentimes, students will ask us questions that we're not ready for, and so teachers with math anxiety tend to avoid those questions by using that whole group. Fielding fewer questions, really focusing on procedural thinking. People with math anxiety tend to teach in the safest, most direct way possible because there's less chance for making mistakes. They will follow the book's examples to a T because it feels safe. And there's a lot of worksheets or commercially prepared worksheets in classrooms where the teacher is math anxious, and a real focus on did you get the right answer. So as a math teacher, we often look at student work and have to try to figure out what was the student thinking here. In a math anxious classroom, there's very little attention paid to the process that a student will use to get to the solution, whereas all of the attention is on that final answer. Elementary teachers that have poor attitudes toward math tend to use methods that foster dependency, seeing the teacher as kind of the main source of information. They're not comfortable being challenged. They're very algorithmic. They provide a lot of teacher-driven practice. These teachers often will publicly celebrate high performers. If you are a math anxious teacher, you tend to think that something that's going to be good for my students is to celebrate when they do well. And while it can be for some students, for the student that is not performing well in that moment, it can be very anxiety-inducing. If I'm seeing people around me being celebrated for doing well and I'm not feeling successful, what is the effect that that might have on me? Math anxious teachers tend to avoid hands-on experiences and manipulatives. These are things that really focus on getting to the conceptual understanding of the mathematics. And so if I, as a teacher, am not feeling strong in my conceptual understanding, my tendency is not to use manipulatives or things that really build that conceptual understanding. And they spend less time in the school day on math instruction. This tends to be mostly true in elementary classrooms where you have one classroom teacher teaching all subjects throughout the day, where they have a little bit of flexibility in how much time is spent in each block. You tend to see that many of them will elongate, for instance, a literacy block at the expense of a math or a science block. All of these things tend to be things that really promote math anxiety in students and perpetuate that cycle of like the generational passing down of math anxiety. So there are things to be aware of, things to notice when we're in classrooms, and if we feel like we're doing any of these things as educators, thinking about how can we reduce these or really change our perspective when it comes to these. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do in the classroom to reduce student anxiety. Obviously, you've taken the first step to reducing student anxiety by being here. Continue searching for opportunities, whether it's courses, classes, professional developments, conversations you can have with your colleagues, really making this a part of your training and your development as a math teacher. But in the meantime, here are a few more concrete practices that reduce math anxiety. Figure out tasks that you can give to your students that will build their confidence. Think of problems that you know every student can succeed in. Maybe it's a problem that doesn't have a right answer, and so any answer a student gets could be correct. Excuse me. Celebrate creative approaches to the problem. So oftentimes we are so concerned with getting students to the right answer that we don't think, wow, that was a really neat way to approach this problem. If you really give your students kind of free rein to figure it out, it's quite amazing how many different ways that they will come up with to approach problems. Normalizing mistakes and errors as learning opportunities is really critical. Making mistakes a part of the learning process. I've heard teachers refer to this as, let me share with you my favorite mistake. And talking about mistakes as your favorite really makes them sound cool all of a sudden. Like, might be a common misconception. It might be something that many of the students are making. Putting mistakes up, having conversations about them, really taking the time to learn from them can reduce math anxiety and tell your students that it's okay. Mistakes happen, and they offer us this really great learning opportunity. Emphasizing the importance of perseverance is key, but we often will say to our students, persevere, keep trying, figure this out, without giving them a lot of guidance on how to do that. If a student does not know where to go, it is critical to be able to have questions or nudge them in order to scaffold their learning to keep them out of their alarm zone. Oftentimes we push them to keep trying so hard that they end up in this alarm zone, and what happens in that zone is they tend to just shut down. So thinking about, where might my students shut down in this lesson? How can I adjust my lesson to make sure that I've got questions, activities, tasks ready for them to push them and keep them moving, keeping them in that zone of proximal development. In addition to all of these things, your language and the words that you use in your classroom are critical. When you say to a student, "This is easy, it shouldn't take long," it's a very encouraging statement, but it can land differently with a student. A student might hear, "If it took me a long time, I might not be smart enough." So telling the word easy, and I think I slipped up earlier in this webinar and I used the word easy. The word easy implies that because you, the teacher, thinks it's easy, means it must be easy for the student. And sometimes that is the case, but oftentimes it's not. And so making a judgment or statement that indicates that you know how this is going to feel for a student could potentially put them into a place of starting to develop that math anxiety. Telling students, and we hear this all the time in classrooms, "This will be on the test," or conversely, "This will not be on the test." When you say something like that, you're really telling students that the only reason to learn whatever it is that you're talking about is because it's on the test. It automatically makes the content high stakes. It makes it something that matters a lot and can stress out students, and it induces that sense of panic that we talked about earlier. Another one that's often heard in classrooms is, "You're smart, you can handle it, you got this." That one can really hit students in a way that says to them, "Crap, I'm struggling, my teacher just said I'm smart, I now might be letting that person down, or I must be letting that person down." And so saying to a student that they can do something because they're smart, not saying that we never want to tell students they're smart, but that is not the reason. When they're struggling through something, it is okay for them to be struggling and to honor that. "You should have learned this last year." Students might hear when you say that, "If I don't remember this, I'm not going to be successful moving forward. I failed last year, I don't know it this year, there's no hope for me moving forward." It can create this real sense of defeat. And one of the most common things we hear, especially in classrooms with math-anxious teachers, "I'm not good at math either." I know you guys aren't going to be using the "you are not a math person" or "I am not a math person," because we've already removed that from our vocabulary, but telling a student that "I'm not good at math either" really gives them permission. It lets them believe that it's okay if they're not. Don't give your students permission. You can say, "Math is challenging for me, but I work through it. I'm math curious. I'm trying to figure it out. It took me a long time to get this, but I figured it out eventually." There's lots of things that are not absolute. Instead of "I'm not good at math," "Math is challenging. I figured it out. I have confidence that you can too." Most importantly with your students, recognizing that their feelings are real. I think this tends to come much easier for adults that do experience math anxiety. If you have math anxiety, it's much easier to understand what your students are experiencing. But folks, adults that are confident or competent in their math abilities tend to not realize how hard it can be for a student that is experiencing math anxiety in the classroom. So with that, So teachers that have positive attitudes toward math are found to encourage student initiative and independence and model persistent behaviors and presented active demonstrations. Any questions on any of the information that I have shared? You can either raise your hand and we'll take questions verbally, or you can type them into the question box. I have a hand raised here from Jacqueline. It looks like you might have raised your hand during the presentation and I missed it, but we can unmute you if you are still wanted to speak. Are you there, Jacqueline? Okay. I'm going to put your hand down because I might have missed it earlier when you had a question. If you have another question, please feel free to raise your hand. All right, I'm going to keep us moving along, and if you do have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or, again, type into the chat box or the question box, and we will get to those. My email address is on the screen if you have any questions that come to you after the webinar is over. Real quick, wanted to share some additional professional development opportunities with you. The Teaching and Learning team posts their opportunities in the LEA Look Forward weekly newsletter, and there's a link there to sign up for that newsletter. There's also online a Teaching and Learning PD calendar as well as an OSSI events calendar that has information. Anybody who did attend the webinar today will also be added to a mailing list to be aware or to be kept in the loop of upcoming opportunities that are offered out of the Teaching and Learning team here at OSSI. So, with that said, thank you very much. Look forward to hearing a lot more positive math talk in all of your classrooms. And again, I will wait around if there are any questions. Please feel free to send them along. Thank you.